So, Jason, thanks for taking a few minutes to talk to us today. And I think I've been following you on LinkedIn for a while, and I think you were surprised. You mentioned that this morning that the administration actually went ahead and imposed tariffs on Mexico and Canada, despite having introduced the USMCA back in July of 2020, of course, which replaced the North American Free Trade Agreement. So I'm kind of really curious as to how did we get here, given all of the fanfare we had when USMCA was introduced?
Dean, that is a good question. And this is the challenge, is it really is kind of hard to understand how we're at this point in time, especially because the administration has advanced so many different rationales for tariffs. It's their revenue stream, they're to balance trade fairness, they're due to border security issues, which certainly in the case of Canada cannot justify what we're seeing. And so this is what's making it, quite difficult to understand how we're here. And the reason I was frankly very surprised with this was when you look at the amount of cross-border trade. The U.S. is much more tied into the Canadian and Mexican economies in terms of our manufacturers exporting their auto parts crossing the border multiple times than we are with China, where there's a huge asymmetry in that we buy a tremendous amount more from China than what they buy from us.
Right.
And a lot of what we sell to them is, very much ag-related.
Yeah, that's a great point. I was talking to a carrier this morning, and they said they'd experienced one of their best Januaries and Februaries ever. They haul coil steel across the borders, so obviously steel is a big part of that. You've been writing about that in Michigan, which kind of leads to which sectors are going to be impacted the most. You've been very concerned about the auto industry in Michigan in particular. And of course, what we're watching is freight rates have been escalating for the best part of since the election. In fact, freight rates have been escalating observably since early November. But the big fear is now that as we pulled forward a lot of that inventory moving cross-border, what's next?
No, it is. And, the U.S. auto sector, I'll be, looking at where we're at now, production based on the Federal Reserve's industrial production data is down somewhere between 6 and 10% from where it was in just the first half of 2024. Payrolls have dropped over 25,000 of that industry from like 1.02 million to 995,000 over that same time period. So really, dealers lots have too much inventory right now. And so it's a sector that is not doing very well at the moment. And so my big concern, we've seen the estimates from Anderson Economic Group here out of East Lansing that we're looking at thousands of dollars added to the cost of vehicles sold in the United States because of this. And so when you still have vehicle sales over 1 million units a year below where they were in 2018 and 2019, it's very difficult to see how this is going to be something good for a lot of the Midwestern economies, especially Michigan and Ohio, that are still so dependent on the health of the auto sector.
Yeah. Agriculture, I think, is the big one that Canadians are very concerned about. You're spot on there. Not just domestic, or when you talk about intra-Canada, but also exports, right? So of grain products in particular, we've got retaliatory tariffs already coming into play. Can you speak to what the impacts might be on exports as it relates to the transport industry?
Yeah. So focusing specifically on U.S. farmers, China has already put in place tariffs now on soybeans. They had actually held off on doing that with the first tranche of the 10% additional tariff. But now with essentially the 20% in total going into effect, they're now going to be tariffing soybeans. So we saw in 2019 exports of soybeans from the United States to Canada, or not to Canada, to China, plunged to the point that we had to pay farmers about $23 billion to make up for the difference. Unfortunately, Mexico is one of the largest sources then for U.S. corn exports. So we've just now picked fights with two of our largest destinations for those goods. And so, again, we would expect declining exports there. No, a lot of that's going to move by rail. So that's more of a railroad story on that piece. But I think what it does is it ties in the issue that we've now picked trade fights with our three biggest trading partners, but the trade looks very different for those three entities. And so then we also are now staring metal tariffs going into effect here in a week or two that will be steel and aluminum. This is worldwide.
Right.
And then a lot more discussion in April of even wider ranging tariffs. And I certainly think the European Union is in the administration's eyesights.
Yeah. I was reading on Reuters this morning about the long-term impact. You wrote about this on your LinkedIn story about the research that showed that the 2019 freight recession was, due in part to the tariffs from 2018. What I was curious about is the long-term effects. But in the short-term effects, we've seen a lot of volatility in the cross-border freight market. We've heard about freight rates doubling last week, carriers asking for higher rates, falling off loads after they'd committed to it. A lot of brokers being unable to cover loads for shippers as they tried to get freight in before midnight last night. But sort of opening our aperture a little bit more, when you look at the long-term effects of this, the Reuters story was very interesting about how China had changed their position on imports of agricultural products from the US. Since the peak of the pandemic, they've dropped about 25%. But since the same period of time, Brazil has become the biggest importer of those products, agricultural products, as far as China's concerned. So it's like there's been a long-term shift away, and that's what our concern is on the freight side, is that the short-term volatility is evident, but what are the long-term effects of a trade war like this?
So, and this is the exact issue. So some of the research right now, there's an economist, her name's Lydia Cox. She's in Wisconsin. She did some research, some of her working papers focus way back in time so we can see these long-term effects of the second Bush administration's tariffs on steel in 2002 and 2003. So getting in the Wayback Machine. And what she found was that there were observable effects 8 years after those tariffs, and that U.S. users of steel were less competitive for exports. And so this ties into this issue of you tariff something like steel or aluminum, you raise the price or raise the cost structure of a lot more users of that good than are involved in making it. And it makes, made U.S. firms less competitive in the global marketplace. Interestingly enough, what she was able to identify was the countries that benefited the most from that were France, Germany, and Japan in terms of their exporters picking up market share the U.S. exporters lost. As you mentioned, China has dramatically shifted their sourcing of corn and soybeans away from the U.S. and towards Brazil, which is now the largest producer in the world. I would expect we'll see further shifting away from that with this. And the one challenge then, especially with Mexico had been one of the big sort of three countries to gain from the prior tariffs on China, Vietnam and India being the other two. And so, for example, a lot of computer production and assembly moved from China to Mexico, and now those computers are getting hit with a 25% tariff.
Yeah, it's hard to not see some sort of demand destruction happening here on a massive front. I think you mentioned that and you thought it would happen very quickly. Can you talk to sort of the mechanics of how that plays out in the context of maybe cross-border freight for our freight community?
Yeah, so let's use auto parts as an example, and it's kind of the motor vehicle sector, because this is by far the most exposed industry.
Right.
From my read of how these tariffs are being implemented, there's no duty drawback provision. So let's imagine there's a 3-part manufacturing process to make this auto part. Stage 1 is done in Canada. Is a manufacturer in Michigan, the stage 2 firm. I import from Canada, but then I export to the stage 3 producer in Canada again, who then exports back to the US. Normally, as that stage 2 firm, I may pay that duty on the import, but then because I'm exporting the product, I get a duty drawback. So in other words, I get my money back because I'm exporting. There's no provisions in what have been released that we know of for this. So what you're going to have is a tariff pyramiding scheme whereby that good gets hit 25% when stage 1 is imported, and then an additional 25% when stage 3 is imported. So they're going to start multiplying on top of themselves. So all of a sudden, let's say vehicles become $5,000 to $8,000 more expensive in the
Mm,
US.
mm,
You have US consumers say, okay, I don't want to pay that. So you start having certain marginal buyers that drop out of the market for
mm.
vehicles. So now let's say vehicle sales, rather than being 1 million units a year below where they were in 1819, they're now 2 million units a year below.
Right.
Well, guess what? That means less employment at parts deal or at the dealerships. That now means less employment at the assembly plants, at the parts plants, cascading upstream to the fabricated metal producers. And all of a sudden, you just have overall less freight demand out there.
Right.
And so that is the big concern right now. In terms of this. And also, too, consumers are going to have to pick and choose.
Mm,
So, as an example, we may see consumers either, reduce their purchases of fresh produce from Mexico
mm.
because it's more expensive. That means less cross-border freight opportunities. Or they may change their budget allocation. And so they say, okay, I still want the fresh produce, but that means I'm going to have a little bit less clothing or a few less consumer electronics. And so you then don't have those goods being imported and the freight movements associated with that.
Yeah. The ISM PMI came out. I know you wrote about this, but Zach Rogers, our good friend from out west, said that the warning lights are flashing, which I thought was a really good way to sort of describe what we're seeing in manufacturing, because it's a big driver of our truckload tonnage. Can you talk to a little bit about what you think might play out there?
Yeah, so just for context, we have been seeing some really encouraging signs in the ISM PMI, especially the new orders component, which is sort of the leading indicator piece, especially in December and really January. Like in January, when that reading came out, in early February, I was excited for that because it was a good sign. And then the reading for February on a seasonally adjusted basis, it took a U-turn, went from expansion that was fairly strong to contraction. But at the same time, the ISM subindex for prices, which captures input prices, really jumped up. And a lot of the respondent comments mentioned cost push pressure from their vendors. And so I think what Zach's picking up is you've got new order momentum slowed substantially in February, and that was mostly due to tariff uncertainty. But you are starting to see already this cost push pressure to drive prices higher. And so that gets you into kind of the nightmarish stagflation scenario where the Fed can't necessarily cut interest rates because they're worried about inflation, but you have demand being reduced, and that puts you in a bad scenario. And so to me, short term tariffs are inflationary. Medium, long term, it's harder to say because the demand destruction provides an escape valve. But for trucking companies, that may be a worse escape valve because that means less freight for us.
Yeah, we talked about this last year where I think we were thinking that 2025 might be the year things turn around. And I think you might have even mentioned 2026 might be the recovery year. At the time, I thought that is a long way off. I hope that doesn't happen, but that's looking like a reality.
I certainly think if these tariffs are put in any length of time, I can't see much growth of demand this year. If anything, it may drop a little bit. And the question then becomes is, do companies make the massive investments they would need to shift production to the United States and let's say away from Mexico? And we will see that on the margin. Like, don't get me wrong. We will see some of that take place. But the question is all the demand destruction on the other hand due to higher, inflationary pressures, due to U.S. exports being negatively affected? Does that offset it? Believe it or not, if you just take a look at U.S. exports, what we call domestic exports for manufactured goods of all types, the amount that goes to Canada, China, and Mexico in 2024, the exports were 7% of the value of all shipments from U.S. manufacturing plants. And if you do the world total of exports, it's 18%. And if anything, for certain industries, that's understating things because let's be real, we don't ship that much concrete across the border, none of it. So these are essentially underestimates. And so the U.S. economy, as much as unfortunately the rhetoric that exists is seemingly that the U.S. just imports and we don't export anything, we are the world's second largest exporter of manufactured goods behind China. And so the concern I have from a demand destruction standpoint as well is our exporters are now going to get hit from all sides, because you've got Canada putting in tariffs, you got Mexico putting in tariffs, you got China putting in tariffs. If we go after the European Union, they're going to do the same thing.
Right.
And so the concern is that this all piles on. And if you even see a 10 or 15% drop in US exports, that's a lot less freight to be moved, because the domestic manufacturing sector has got less stuff to ship.
And we've already moved a lot of that freight, Jason. If you think about imports, we've had a record January. I think you said it was the highest ever. If we've just been spending the last 2 months pulling forward a lot of cross-border freight to get ahead of tariffs, a lot of that freight's been moved that we might have normally seen over the summer.
Well, so the caveat with that is really diving into the data. It appears that a lot of that January bump was, believe it or not, the U.S. importing a near record amount of gold from Switzerland.
Really?
And yeah, it had to do with the pricing differentials for commodity markets. And so much of that, really diving into the data, is very likely gold. But here's the but. We did see consumer imports on a seasonally adjusted basis in January were really up from December. And the one category from December data I could see compared to November was toys and sporting goods. And those are screaming vulnerable to China tariffs. So on March 6th in the morning, we get the detailed January data for trade, and that should really kind of help get a little bit of a sense, I think, especially stuff coming in from China. And then unfortunately, it'll take a while to get the February data to get a sense of what came in. But Dean, as you mentioned, with how much freight rates went up, for those cross-border shipments, you can't help but think that didn't mean that there wasn't an increase in freight.
Yeah. You've got your truckload ton-mile index will be out a few weeks, right? A couple of weeks. So what are your thoughts on that? You think a downward trend there?
So I'd say December was a pretty good month. January is probably about to be the same. Once we get the January wholesale data, we'll know a little bit more. January manufacturing was okay. It wasn't phenomenal. And we'll go from there. Again, that ton-mile index, it is a slow slog to see that thing typically get itself going. In a perfect world, what I was hoping was pretty much the president was going to say, all this tariff stuff was just, he was going to get elected and say, well, thank you for voting for me, but this actually is a really poor idea. I changed my mind.
Right.
And we're not doing it. And then I would have said, hey, by June this year, things will be rocking and rolling. So I'm not expecting to see much of a bump at the moment.
Right.
And again, the big sector I'm watching is auto. I was just pulling the rail carload loading data for the last couple weeks. And I'll tell you, the 2025 trend line so far is not encouraging in comparison to where we were at. I mean, loadings are, for example, the last 4 weeks, 12% below where they were for the same weeks in 2018.
Right. Where did you have the truck ton-mile index in December pegged at? Was it about 2018 Q4 numbers?
It was. No, I think that number is too high, though. So we're getting massive benchmarking this year from with the economic census from 2022 getting included in all the official releases. And so I actually think ton miles right now are basically 2019 levels. And part of the reason for that is that's kind of where payroll is. But when you look at the LTL numbers in terms of tonnage, they're down year over year in general. And that's with yellow already having failed.
Yeah.
And so there's really, to me, I think I look at the whole picture and I'm like, it is not good right now for volumes. We were hoping this was going to be a better year.
Right.
We now have a tremendous gale force headwind blowing against us, unless we get some type of announcement, with the State of the Union saying, hey, this stuff isn't actually happening, and I'm happy with Canada and Mexico.
Yeah, and that's a possibility.
Yeah, it made great television. I mean.
All right. Hey, thanks, Jason. I appreciate your insights as always. Great to have you on.
Thanks for having me.